Think about the last time you had a headache or a sudden fever. You likely walked into your bathroom, opened the medicine cabinet, unscrewed the cap of a familiar plastic bottle, and swallowed a pill. You didn't think twice about it. You didn't inspect the capsule. You trusted the brand. You trusted the tamper-evident seal. You trusted the safety of the modern world. But that absolute, unquestioning trust did not always exist. It was paid for in blood. In the autumn of 1982, the simple act of taking a painkiller became a game of Russian roulette. A phantom killer walked the aisles of ordinary drugstores in the American Midwest, turning a household remedy into a weapon of mass terror. In a matter of days, 7 innocent people were dead, a multinational corporation was brought to its knees, and the entire nation was gripped by a panic unseen since the height of the Cold War. No one was safe. And worst of all, the killer was never caught.
Midnight Ledger Audio presents The Chicago Tylenol Murders, narrated by Midnight, and conducted after hours of exhaustive research by Bryan Midnight. Chapter 1. The First Victim, September 28, 1982.
To understand the sheer terror of the Chicago Tylenol murders, you must first understand the era. In 1982, Tylenol was not just a brand, it was an American institution. Manufactured by McNeil Consumer Products, a subsidiary of the healthcare giant Johnson & Johnson, Tylenol controlled a staggering 35% of the over-the-counter analgesic market. It was the go-to medication for millions. If a child had the sniffles or a worker had a sore back, they reached for the red and white box. The most popular variant was Extra-Strength Tylenol, sold in gelatin capsules. Let's examine the anatomy of a 1982 gelatin capsule. Unlike the solid, pressed tablets or the safety-sealed caplets we use today, a standard capsule was made of 2 hollow gelatin halves, one slightly wider than the other, that simply slid together to hold a dry powder inside. They were popular because they were easy to swallow and dissolved quickly in the stomach. But they harbored a fatal design flaw. Anyone could pull the 2 halves apart, empty the contents, refill them with something else, and slide them back together. There was no glue, no blister packs, no foil seals across the mouth of the bottle. The bottle was simply placed in a cardboard box, glued at the flaps, and shipped to a store shelf. It was an open door. And on September 28, 1982, someone walked right through it. Elk Grove Village, Illinois, a quiet, middle-class suburb just outside of Chicago. It was a Tuesday morning. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up feeling under the weather. She had a sore throat and a runny nose like any caring parent. Her mother gave her a pain reliever to ease her symptoms. She handed Mary a single capsule of extra-strength Tylenol taken from a freshly purchased bottle. Mary went into the bathroom, swallowed the pill with a glass of water, and closed the door. Moments later, Mary's parents heard a terrifying sound, a heavy thud against the bathroom floor. They called out to her. No answer. When they forced the door open, they found their 12-year-old daughter lying unconscious, struggling to breathe, her eyes fixed and dilated. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, frantically trying to stabilize her vitals, but the damage was catastrophic and instantaneous. By 9:28 a.m., Mary Kellerman was pronounced dead. The doctors were baffled. A healthy young girl had suffered a massive, sudden cardiovascular collapse. They suspected a stroke or perhaps a hidden, fatal congenital heart defect. Tragic, but entirely natural. No one suspected the Tylenol. Why would they? But 30 miles away in another Chicago suburb, the poison was already waiting for its next victims, and the horror was about to multiply.
Chapter 2. The Tragedy of the Janus Family.
Arlington Heights, Illinois. Later that same day, Adam Janus was a 27-year-old postal worker. He was a healthy, robust young man with a wife and small children. Shortly after 11 a.m., Adam began to experience mild chest pains. Assuming he was coming down with a routine bug or muscle strain, he went to his local Jewel Foods grocery store. He walked down the pharmacy aisle, picked up a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, paid for it, and went home. He went into his kitchen, extracted 2 capsules and swallowed them. Within minutes, Adam collapsed. His breathing became erratic and shallow. His wife frantically called an ambulance. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to Northwest Community Hospital in Arlington Heights. Despite the desperate efforts of the emergency room staff, Adam Janus flatlined. He was pronounced dead at 3:15 p.m. The emergency room doctors, completely unaware of Mary Kellerman's death miles away, were perplexed. A massive heart attack in a perfectly healthy 27-year-old? It was incredibly rare, but not biologically impossible. They ruled it a massive myocardial infarction. What happened next is a sequence of events so intensely cruel, it defies comprehension. That evening, the Janus family gathered at Adam's house in Arlington Heights to mourn his sudden, shocking death. Among the grieving relatives were Adam's 25-year-old brother, Stanley Janus, and Stanley's 19-year-old newlywed wife, Teresa. The house was filled with weeping, shock, and the crushing weight of sudden loss. Both Stanley and Teresa developed pounding tension headaches from crying and stress. Looking for relief, Stanley went into Adam's kitchen. He found the bottle of Extra-Strength Tylenol sitting on the counter, the exact same bottle Adam had purchased just hours before. Stanley took a capsule. He handed one to his young wife, Teresa. They swallowed them. According to family members present, within a matter of minutes, Stanley Janus grabbed his chest and slumped to the floor. Before the family could even react to Stanley's collapse, Teresa seized up, her eyes rolling back in her head, and she dropped unconscious beside her husband. The family, already shattered by grief, descended into pure panic. Ambulances were called back to the exact same house they had visited just hours earlier. Stanley and Teresa were rushed to the same emergency room. Stanley was pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. Teresa, clinging to life by a thread, was placed on advanced life support. She would die 2 days later. In less than 12 hours, 3 members of the same family had been wiped out. The doctors at Northwest Community Hospital were staring at a medical impossibility. 3 young, healthy people dropping dead in the same house on the same day. This wasn't a genetic heart defect. This was an environmental toxin. Was it a carbon monoxide leak in the house? Was it contaminated food?
Chapter 3. The Smell of Bitter Almonds.
Helen Jensen was the public health nurse for Arlington Heights. When she received word of the catastrophic cluster of deaths in the Janus household, she immediately drove to the residence. Jensen was meticulous. She interviewed the surviving, traumatized family members. She checked the furnace for carbon monoxide. She checked the refrigerator for spoiled food. During her interviews, she asked a crucial question.
Did they take any medication?
The family pointed to the kitchen counter. There sat a red and white bottle of Extra-Strength Tylenol. Jensen picked it up. She found the receipt from the Jewel Food store. The bottle had been purchased that very morning. The bottle contained 50 capsules. Jensen counted the remaining pills. There were 44 left. Adam had taken 2. Stanley had taken 2. Teresa had taken 2. 6 missing pills. 3 dead bodies. Jensen turned to the police investigators on the scene and made a bold, terrifying declaration.
It's the Tylenol. The pills are killing them.
Initially, investigators were highly skeptical. Tylenol was a trusted factory-sealed product. The idea that an over-the-counter painkiller was causing instant death sounded like science fiction. But Jensen refused to back down. She gathered the bottle and handed it over to investigator Nick Pichos from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. Pichos took the bottle back to the morgue. He called Dr. Edmund R. Donahue, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner. Dr. Donahue, reviewing the sudden, catastrophic cellular collapse of the victims, began to suspect one of the most notorious and lethal toxins known to science: cyanide. Cyanide acts as an invisible executioner at a microscopic level. It doesn't cause a heart attack, it causes cellular asphyxiation. The poison binds to an enzyme in the mitochondria of your cells, preventing them from utilizing oxygen. Essentially, your lungs are breathing in oxygen. Your heart is pumping it through your blood, but your cells are suffocating. The brain and heart, which require the most oxygen, shut down within minutes. Dr. Donahue told Pichos over the phone.
Open the bottle. Do you smell anything?
Pichos unscrewed the cap and carefully brought the bottle to his nose. He noted a distinct, strange odor wafting from the plastic. It smelled like bitter almonds. That was the smoking gun. Potassium cyanide naturally carries the scent of bitter almonds, though a significant percentage of the human population lacks the genetic ability to smell it. Pichos could. The capsules were immediately rushed to Dr. Michael Schaefer, the chief toxicologist for Cook County. Schaefer's team opened the remaining 44 capsules from the Janus bottle. Inside 4 of them, instead of the stark white acetaminophen powder, they found a gray, slightly moist substance. They tested it. The results were apocalyptic. Each of those 4 tampered capsules contained approximately 65 milligrams of potassium cyanide. The lethal dose for an adult human is roughly 200 milligrams. However, further testing across all the victims' bottles revealed capsules packed with up to 10,000 times the fatal amount. The killer hadn't just sprinkled poison into the pills. They had completely emptied the acetaminophen and packed the gelatin shells to the brim with pure, deadly cyanide. Anyone who swallowed one was effectively dead before it even reached their stomach. By pure luck, the paramedics who treated 12-year-old Mary Kellerman had inventoried the medications in her bathroom. Investigators cross-referenced her bottle with the Janus bottle. They shared the same lot number, MC2880. The authorities now knew exactly what was happening, and the realization sparked pure, unadulterated panic. The deaths of the Janus family and Mary Kellerman weren't isolated accidents. Someone was manufacturing poisoned Tylenol and placing it on grocery store shelves in the Chicago suburbs, and the bodies were still piling up.
We are currently approaching the foundational core of this investigation. The timeline of September 29th is expanding. If you've been listening to Midnight Ledger audio and appreciate the hours of research of Bryan Midnight puts into these archives, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It helps us continue to bring these massive, unabridged documentaries to light. Chapter 4. The Expanding Circle, September 29, 1982.
By the late afternoon of September 29th, the Cook County Medical Examiner's office was staring into the abyss. They had 4 bodies: Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, and Teresa Janus, who lay brain-dead on a ventilator, all linked by a single terrifying thread: extra-strength Tylenol laced with industrial-grade potassium cyanide. But the nightmare was not contained to Elk Grove Village and Arlington Heights. The killer had cast a much wider net across the Chicago metropolitan area. 30 miles south, in the town of Winfield, Mary Reiner was experiencing the greatest joy of her life. She was 27 years old, and she had just returned home from the hospital after giving birth to her 4th child, a healthy baby boy. The physical toll of childbirth had left her exhausted and sore. Looking for relief, Mary asked her husband to pick up some painkillers. He went to Frank's Finer Foods, a local grocery store, and purchased a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. Mary took the capsules. Within minutes, she collapsed in front of her family. Her husband, frantic, called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived to find Mary in full cardiac and respiratory arrest. They rushed her to Central DuPage Hospital. Despite their most desperate efforts, Mary Reiner, a mother who had just brought new life into the world days prior, was pronounced dead. At the exact same time, in the suburb of Elmhurst, Mary McFarland was at work. She was 31 years old, a mother of 2, working at the Illinois Bell Telephone Center. She complained to her coworkers of a stubborn tension headache. She reached into her purse and pulled out a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol she had purchased from a local Osco drugstore in Schaumburg. She swallowed the capsules. Moments later, she slumped over her desk, violently convulsing. Her terrified colleagues called 911-er. She was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where she too fell into a deep, irreversible coma and died. Let us analyze the sheer terror of this timeline. In less than 24 hours, 6 people across multiple unconnected suburbs had dropped dead from the exact same cause. They did not know each other. They did not shop at the same stores. Initially, investigators hoped this was an isolated manufacturing error. Perhaps a vat at a single Johnson & Johnson facility had been accidentally contaminated. But when the toxicologists tested Mary McFarland's bottle, they found something that completely shattered that theory. The Janus family and Mary Kellerman had died from Tylenol bearing the lot number MC2880, but Mary McFarland's bottle was from a completely different batch, lot 100,000 MD, and Mary Reiner's bottle was from yet another batch, lot MB20738. Furthermore, these lots were manufactured in entirely different facilities across the country, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas. There was only one logical conclusion, and it was horrifying. This was not a factory defect. This was not a corporate accident. Someone had walked into various drugstores and supermarkets across the Chicago area, taken bottles of Tylenol off the shelves, carried them out, opened the capsules, packed them with lethal cyanide, and then returned to the stores to place the poisoned bottles perfectly back on the shelves, waiting for random victims to purchase them. It was an act of pure, indiscriminate domestic terrorism.
Chapter 5. The Woman on the Tape.
As September turned into October, The police were frantically trying to piece together the victim's movements. But there was one victim who hadn't been found yet. Paula Prince was 35 years old, a flight attendant for United Airlines. She was vibrant, independent, and lived in a high-rise apartment in the Old Town neighborhood of downtown Chicago. On September 29th, Paula had just completed a long, grueling 3-day sequence of flights. She landed at O'Hare International Airport, exhausted and likely suffering from the typical aches and jet lag of a senior flight attendant. On her drive home, she stopped at a Walgreens drugstore on North Avenue, a busy intersection in the heart of Chicago. She walked down the aisles, picked up a bottle of Extra-Strength Tylenol, paid at the register, and went home to her apartment. For 2 days, Paula's family and friends tried to reach her. Her phone rang unanswered. When she failed to show up for her next scheduled flight, a highly uncharacteristic move for a dedicated airline employee, her sister became frantic. Her sister and a friend went to Paula's apartment building. They convinced the superintendent to open the door. Inside, they found Paula Prince lying dead on her bathroom floor. Sitting on the vanity sink next to her was an open bottle of Extra-Strength Tylenol. Beside it was a single, unswallowed capsule. But Paula Prince's tragic death provided investigators with something the other 6 victims could not: a visual record. When the Chicago Police Department realized Paula had purchased the Tylenol at the North Avenue Walgreens, they immediately descended on the store. Unlike the smaller suburban grocers, this specific Walgreens was equipped with a CCTV security camera positioned over the cash registers. Detectives pulled the grainy, black and white tape and scoured the footage. There, frozen in time on the evening of September 29th, was Paula Prince. She was standing at the register paying for the exact bottle of poison Tylenol that would kill her hours later. But it wasn't Paula that made the detectives' blood run cold. It was the man standing just a few feet behind her. In the background of the surveillance photo, blurred but unmistakable, was a man with a beard, staring in the direction of the register. Was this just another customer waiting in line? Or was this the Phantom of Chicago? Did the killer follow Paula to the register to watch his lethal trap be sprung? The Chicago police released the surveillance photo to the public, hoping someone could identify the bearded man. He became the face of the nation's paranoia, but despite thousands of tips, the bearded man in the background was never conclusively identified as a suspect. He melted back into the shadows of the city.
Chapter 6. The Panic and the Bullhorns.
By October 1, 1982, the city of Chicago and the entire United States was gripped by a level of panic usually reserved for wartime. Mayor Jane Byrne took to the airwaves. Local television programming was interrupted by emergency broadcasts. But the authorities knew that televisions and radios weren't enough. They had to reach people now before they reached into their medicine cabinets. In a scene straight out of a dystopian film, Chicago police cruisers drove slowly down the suburban streets of Arlington Heights, Elk Grove Village, and Winfield. Officers leaned out of their windows with bullhorns, their voices echoing off the brick houses.
Attention citizens, do not take Tylenol, I repeat. Do not consume any Tylenol products. Turn in all Tylenol to your local fire or police departments immediately.
The terror was absolute. Hospitals were flooded with thousands of panicked citizens. If someone had a stomach ache or felt a slight flush, they rushed to the emergency room, terrified they had ingested cyanide. Poison control centers received over 700 calls a day. Every Tylenol bottle in the country suddenly felt like an unexploded bomb sitting in the family bathroom. And what about the manufacturer? Johnson & Johnson was facing total, catastrophic annihilation. At the time, crisis management for massive corporations usually involved denying responsibility, shifting blame, and protecting the stock price at all costs. But James Burke, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, made a decision that would forever change the history of corporate America. Burke didn't hide. He opened the doors to the FBI and the FDA. And then, he did the unthinkable. He ordered a complete nationwide recall of all Tylenol products. Burke ordered 31 million bottles of Tylenol pulled from store shelves, pharmacies, and hospitals across the United States. Let me repeat that number. 31 million bottles. The retail value of the recalled medication was over $100 million, roughly $330 million in today's money. The company sent out telegrams to 500,000 doctors, hospitals, and distributors. They suspended all television and print advertising for the drug. They offered a completely free exchange program, urging Americans to trade in their potentially lethal capsules for solid tablets, which were much harder to tamper with. It was an unprecedented financial sacrifice, but it worked. Johnson & Johnson saved countless lives by clearing the shelves before the killer could strike again. When the FDA and the FBI gathered and tested the millions of recalled bottles from the Chicago area, they found something chilling. They discovered a handful of other bottles sitting on the shelves of different Costco and Jewel stores that were packed with cyanide. They had caught them just in time. The killer had seeded the city with dozens of lethal traps. One woman had actually purchased a tampered bottle, but when she opened it, she felt that the capsules looked sticky and smelled strange. Trusting her intuition, she threw them away, narrowly escaping the fate of Mary Kellerman and the Janus family. But clearing the shelves didn't catch the killer. The FBI, the Chicago Police Department, and the Illinois Department of Law Enforcement formed a massive, unprecedented task force. They needed a suspect. They needed a motive. And then, a letter arrived in the mail.
Art Midnight and Bryan Midnight have combed through thousands of pages of FBI declassified documents to bring you the exact timeline of this terrifying week in 1982. If you are captivated by this exhaustive, long, deep dive into the Chicago Tylenol murders, please take a second to subscribe to Midnight Ledger Audio. Your support allows us to keep the ledger open and the microphone on. Chapter 7. The Extortion Letter.
By the first week of October 1982, the Chicago Tylenol murders had become the largest criminal investigation in the history of the United States. Over 100 federal agents, state police, and local detectives were crammed into a command center in Des Plaines, Illinois. They had a mountain of recalled Tylenol bottles, thousands of terrified citizens calling in tips, and absolutely zero physical evidence pointing to a suspect. The killer was a ghost. He had walked into Jewel Osco's, Walgreens, and Dominic's grocery stores, planted his lethal traps, and melted into the crowds. But then, a break, not from the streets of Chicago, but from a mailroom in New Brunswick, New Jersey, the corporate headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. Amidst the flood of panicked inquiries and corporate crisis management, executives at Johnson & Johnson received an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was not a message of sympathy. It was a ransom note. The author of the letter claimed absolute responsibility for the cyanide-laced Tylenol that was terrorizing the nation. The letter was chillingly direct. It demanded that Johnson & Johnson wire exactly $1 million to a specific bank account in Chicago. If the corporation failed to pay, the author promised that the poisonings would not stop. More bottles would be seeded, more people would die. For the FBI, this was the crack in the armor they had been praying for. A ghost doesn't leave a bank account routing number. Agents immediately descended on the bank in Chicago. They pulled the records for the account listed in the extortion letter. The account belonged to a defunct travel agency, but investigators dug deeper, looking for who had access to it, who had set it up, and who had a grudge. The trail led them to a man named James William Lewis, or, as he was known by one of his many aliases, Robert Richardson. But when the FBI went to find him, James Lewis was already gone. He and his wife had vanished, slipping out of Chicago and disappearing into the massive, sprawling grid of New York City. The hunt for the Tylenol killer had officially shifted from a forensic puzzle to a nationwide manhunt.
Chapter 8. The Grifter and the Poison Playbook.
Who was James William Lewis? He was not a dock worker or a disgruntled factory employee. He was a highly intelligent, articulate, and deeply arrogant tax accountant and self-styled financial consultant. He had a history of running scams, using aliases, and slipping through the fingers of the law. In December of 1982, 2 months after the murders, the FBI finally caught up with him. They tracked him to a public library in New York City. Lewis was arrested and taken into federal custody. When investigators sat across from him in the interrogation room, they expected a denial. They expected a lawyer. Instead, James Lewis wanted to talk. He wanted to show the FBI just how smart he was. Lewis emphatically denied putting cyanide in the Tylenol bottles. He claimed he was not a murderer. But when investigators asked him how the killer might have pulled it off, Lewis didn't hesitate. With chilling precision, he practically drew them a diagram. He explained, in forensic detail, how the killer would walk into a store, buy the Tylenol, take it home, pull the gelatin capsules apart, fill them with potassium cyanide, and then quietly return to the store to place the boxes back on the shelves. He knew exactly how it was done. The FBI searched Lewis's belongings. They found a book on poisoning, and, according to confidential law enforcement documents later leaked to the press, they found James Lewis's fingerprints on the specific pages detailing the lethal properties of cyanide. So, why did he write the extortion letter if he wasn't the killer? During his trial, Lewis's defense attorneys presented a bizarre, convoluted motive. They claimed Lewis never intended to collect the $1 million. Instead, the bank account he listed in the ransom letter belonged to his wife's former employer, a man Lewis despised. The defense argued that Lewis sent the extortion letter to focus the attention of the authorities on his enemy, hoping the FBI would raid the man's business and ruin his life. It was a staggering display of arrogance and malice, but the FBI found a massive hole in Lewis's timeline. Lewis claimed he had worked on the extortion letter for 3 days before mailing it. But postal inspectors examined the postmark on the envelope. It was stamped October 1st, 1982. If Lewis spent 3 days drafting the letter, he would have had to start writing it before the very first news reports of the Tylenol poisonings even hit the press. How could he extort a company for a crime that the public didn't even know had happened yet? When confronted with this impossible timeline, Lewis panicked and recanted his story. James William Lewis was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. But despite the DOJ investigators being utterly convinced he was the mastermind behind the murders, they simply did not have the physical evidence to charge him with 7 counts of homicide. Years later, in 2010, Lewis would submit his DNA to the authorities. It did not match any of the DNA recovered from the tampered Tylenol bottles. Lewis served his time. He continued to deny his involvement until the day he died in July of 2023 at the age of 76. Was he a criminal mastermind who committed the perfect crime, or just a sociopathic grifter who tried to profit off a national tragedy? The FBI wasn't sure, because while they were hunting Lewis in New York, the Chicago police had their eyes on another man. A man who lived in the suburbs, a man who owned the exact poison that killed the Janus family.
Chapter 9. The Erratic Dock Worker.
If James Lewis was the smooth, calculating extortionist, Roger Arnold was the exact opposite. Roger Arnold was a dock worker at a Jewel Osco warehouse in Melrose Park, Illinois. Remember, Jewel Osco was one of the primary grocery chains where the poison Tylenol was found. Arnold had direct access to the supply chain of the very stores that sold death to the Chicago suburbs. But it wasn't just his job that drew the attention of the police. It was his behavior. In the weeks following the murders, the Chicago police received a tip from a man named Marty Sinclair. Sinclair owned a local bar that Arnold frequented. Sinclair told detectives that Arnold's marriage had recently dissolved and the dock worker was becoming increasingly erratic, angry, and paranoid, but it was what Arnold talked about when he was drinking that made Sinclair call the cops. Arnold had allegedly boasted about possessing a mysterious white powder. He talked about how easy it would be to kill people with it. Detectives quietly began to pull the threads of Roger Arnold's life. What they found was a terrifying web of circumstantial evidence that placed him uncomfortably close to the victims. Victim number 4, Mary Reiner, had died after taking Tylenol purchased in the suburb of Winfield. Investigators discovered that Roger Arnold had worked at the same warehouse as Mary Reiner's father. Even more chilling. Arnold's wife had recently been treated at a psychiatric hospital located directly across the street from the very store where Mary Reiner bought her poisoned pills. The police moved in. They executed a search warrant on Roger Arnold's home. They did not find a stockpile of poisoned Tylenol, but they found something just as damning. Sitting in his house was a copy of an underground anarchist manual titled The Poor Man's James Bond. Inside this book were detailed step-by-step instructions on how to manufacture homemade potassium cyanide, and when interrogated, Arnold admitted to the police that he did in fact possess potassium cyanide. The police had a man with access to the supply chain. A man who owned a manual on making cyanide, a man who admitted to owning the poison, a man with geographic connections to the victims. They held Arnold. They interrogated him for hours. But Arnold refused to confess to the Tylenol murders. And just like James Lewis, there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints on the bottles, no CCTV footage placing him in the stores, to tie him definitively to the crime. The police were forced to let him go. But the damage to Roger Arnold's psyche was already done. The media attention, the police harassment, and his own unraveling mental state created a powder keg. In the summer of 1983, Roger Arnold decided he wanted revenge on the man who had tipped off the police. He grabbed a gun and went looking for the bar owner, Marty Sinclair. Arnold spotted a man walking out of a bar with a group of friends. Believing it was Sinclair, Arnold raised his weapon and fired. He shot and killed John Stanisha, a computer consultant and father of 3 who had absolutely nothing to do with the Tylenol murders or the police investigation. It was a case of mistaken identity fueled by paranoid rage. Roger Arnold was convicted of second-degree murder in January of 1984. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. In 1996, speaking from behind bars, Arnold told a reporter, "I killed a man, a perfectly innocent person. I had choices. I could have walked away." Roger Arnold died in 2008. 2 years later, investigators actually exhumed his corpse to extract a DNA sample from his femur bone, desperate to match it to the microscopic traces left on the 1982 Tylenol bottles. The DNA did not match. The grifter and the dock worker. Two men whose lives were destroyed by the Tylenol murders, yet neither could be proven to be the phantom. The FBI was back to square one, and the nightmare was about to mutate. Because while the original killer went silent, a new breed of monster was taking notes.
We are approaching the complete investigation into the Chicago Tylenol murders. If you have reached this part of the documentary, you are a true investigator of history. Please consider subscribing to Midnight Ledger Audio and liking this video. Your engagement tells the algorithm to push these massive, meticulously researched archives to other true crime fans. Now, let us return to the aftermath. Chapter 10: Pandora's Box and the Copycat Killers.
When the FBI failed to catch the Chicago Tylenol killer, they didn't just leave a case unsolved. They left a blueprint. The media coverage of the 1982 murders was inescapable. For weeks, every newspaper, every evening news broadcast, and every radio station detailed exactly how the killer had pulled off the crime. They explained how easy it was to open a capsule. They explained how potassium cyanide worked. They showed the nation the fatal flaw in American consumer packaging. The Chicago Phantom had opened Pandora's box, and out crawled a new breed of killer, the copycats. These were not random acts of terrorism. These were cold, calculated domestic murders, executed by people who realized they could hide their own personal motives behind the terrifying shadow of a random, nationwide panic. If a husband or a wife dropped dead of cyanide poisoning, the police wouldn't look at the spouse, they would look at the manufacturer, or so the copycats thought. The first major echo of the Chicago tragedy struck 4 years later. In February of 1986, Diane Ellsroth was a 23-year-old woman visiting her boyfriend in Yonkers, New York. Complaining of a minor stomachache, she opened a brand new bottle of Extra-Strength Tylenol, took 2 capsules, and went to sleep. She never woke up. The capsules were laced with lethal doses of potassium cyanide. Once again, Johnson & Johnson was forced to pull their products from shelves in specific regions. The FBI swarmed Yonkers. But unlike Chicago, the Yonkers poisoning appeared isolated. It was a terrifying reminder that the vulnerability still existed, but it did not escalate into a mass casualty event. However, on the other side of the country, in Washington state, a far more sinister plot was unfolding. Bruce Nickel, a 52-year-old heavy equipment operator, came home from work with a headache. He took 2 capsules from a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin. Minutes later, he collapsed. Initially, doctors believed he had died of natural causes, specifically emphysema. Less than a week later, in a neighboring town, 40-year-old bank manager Susan Snow took 2 Excedrin capsules for a morning headache. She collapsed in her bathroom and died. An autopsy quickly revealed the presence of cyanide, and the connection was made. Panic swept through the Pacific Northwest. Excedrin was pulled from the shelves. The public braced for a repeat of the Chicago massacre. But the FBI noticed something strange. When the news of Susan Snow's cyanide poisoning broke, Bruce Nickel's widow, a woman named Stella Nickel, contacted the police. She claimed her husband had also died after taking Excedrin from a specific lot. The police exhumed Bruce's body, retested his tissue, and confirmed her claim. Bruce Nickel had been murdered with cyanide. But Stella Nickel made a fatal error. She was too eager. She wanted the police to know her husband died from poisoned Excedrin because she wanted the accidental death insurance payout. Investigators dug into Stella's life. They discovered that shortly before Bruce's death, Stella had taken out over $70,000 in life insurance policies on him, policies that paid out extra in the event of an accidental death. Even more damning, the FBI checked her local library records. Stella Nickel had checked out numerous books on toxic plants and poisons, including a volume detailing the lethal effects of cyanide. Stella Nichol didn't want to terrorize Washington state. She just wanted to kill her husband for the insurance money, but she knew that a simple poisoning would point directly to her, so she bought several bottles of Excedrin, laced the capsules with cyanide, placed one bottle in her own home for her husband to take, and then placed the other bottles on the shelves of local grocery stores. Susan Snow, a mother and a bank manager, died simply because Stella Nichol needed a random victim to make her husband's murder look like the work of a serial killer. Stella Nichol was arrested, convicted of 2 counts of murder, and sentenced to 90 years in federal prison. She became the first person convicted under the new federal anti-tampering laws passed in the wake of the Chicago murders.
Chapter 11. The Unsolved Saboteur.
The horror of the copycat didn't stop with Excedrin. In 1991, the nightmare returned to Washington state. This time, the weapon of choice was Sudafed 12-hour capsules. Kathleen Danaker and Stanley McWhorter, 2 completely unconnected individuals living in the Seattle area, both purchased boxes of Sudafed to treat cold symptoms. Both swallowed cyanide-laced capsules. Both died agonizing deaths. A third victim, Jennifer Melling, also took a poisoned Sudafed capsule. She collapsed and slipped into a deep coma. Miraculously, Jennifer survived, waking up in the hospital days later. The FBI immediately launched an investigation. They knew the playbook now. They didn't just look at the store shelves, they looked at the spouses. They focused on Jennifer Melling's husband, Joseph Melling. Joseph and Jennifer had a tumultuous, abusive marriage. They were in the midst of a bitter separation. Investigators discovered that Joseph had recently taken out a massive $700,000 life insurance policy on his wife. When the FBI traced the cyanide, they found that Joseph Melling, using a fake business name, had purchased sodium cyanide from a chemical supply company. Like Stella Nichol, Joseph Melling believed he could outsmart the FBI by hiding his wife's murder behind a smokescreen of random consumer terrorism. He laced multiple boxes of Sudafed, placed one in his home for his wife, and distributed the rest to local drugstores. Kathleen Danaker and Stanley McWhorter were nothing more than collateral damage in Melling's twisted plot to collect an insurance payout. Joseph Melling was arrested, convicted in a federal Seattle court, and sentenced to life in prison. From Procter & Gamble's Incaprin pain reliever being pulled from the market after a massive spiking hoax in Detroit to a University of Texas student named Kenneth Ferries, whose cyanide-laced anisin capsules were eventually ruled a tragic suicide disguised as a tampering event, the 1980s and early 90s were an era defined by consumer paranoia. The Chicago Tylenol killer had proven that the American public was entirely exposed. The pharmaceutical industry was bleeding billions of dollars in lost revenue and recalls. They had to adapt, or they would be destroyed. The era of the simple, unguarded gelatin capsule was over.
Chapter 12. The Armor of the Modern Isle.
If you look in your medicine cabinet today, you will see the permanent scars left by the Chicago Tylenol murders. Before 1982, opening a bottle of aspirin was as simple as unscrewing the cap. Today, it is a multi-layered fortress. When Johnson & Johnson executed their unprecedented recall of 31 million bottles, financial analysts predicted the death of the Tylenol brand. Their market share plummeted from a commanding 35% to a devastating 8% almost overnight. How could a company survive when their flagship product had become synonymous with sudden, agonizing death? The answer lay in absolute, unwavering transparency. Under the guidance of public relations executive Harold Burson, Johnson & Johnson CEO James Burke refused to hide behind lawyers. He went on national television. He expressed profound grief for the victims. He worked directly with the FBI and the FDA. A Washington Post article at the time noted, Johnson & Johnson has effectively demonstrated how a major business ought to handle a disaster. They were honest with the public. But an apology wasn't enough to get Tylenol back into the homes of terrified Americans. The product had to be physically reinvented. In November of 1982, just weeks after the murders, Johnson & Johnson reintroduced Tylenol to the market. It was accompanied by heavy price promotions, but more importantly, it was encased in a revolutionary new package. It was the birth of tamper-evident packaging. The new bottles featured a triple-seal defense system. The outer cardboard box had its flaps tightly glued shut, tearing visibly if forced open. The plastic cap was wrapped in a tight, shrink-wrapped plastic band, and beneath the cap, the mouth of the bottle was sealed with a heavy-duty foil induction seal that had to be punctured to reach the medication. It seems entirely ordinary to us now, but in 1982, It was a technological marvel that restored the psychological safety of the American consumer.
Chapter 13. The Halloween Hysteria of 1982.
October 1982. The Tylenol murders were fresh in the minds of every parent in America. The killer had not been caught. The police had no viable suspects, and Halloween was approaching. For decades, the urban legend of the sadistic stranger handing out poisoned candy or apples with razor blades had haunted the periphery of Halloween. It was a boogeyman story rarely grounded in actual, documented events. But the Chicago Tylenol murders turned that urban legend into a terrifying, plausible reality. If a ghost could walk into a jewel-osco and poison random bottles of medicine just to watch the world burn, what was stopping someone from injecting cyanide into fun-sized chocolate bars? The panic was absolute. Across the United States, city councils and mayors discouraged trick-or-treating. Some towns banned it entirely, enforcing curfews to keep children off the streets. Hospitals offered to X-ray children's candy bags for free. Grocery stores reported that nationwide candy sales plummeted by over 20%. Parents threw away millions of dollars worth of perfectly safe chocolate and caramel, terrified of a phantom killer who might have shifted his focus from the pharmacy to the candy aisle. The Halloween of 1982 became a ghost town in many American suburbs. The innocent joy of running house to house was replaced by mall parties and strictly supervised indoor events. The Chicago killer didn't just steal 7 lives. He stole the innocence of an entire era. He proved that the safe, brightly lit aisles of our grocery stores were just as dangerous as a dark alley. And as we close this massive chapter of our investigation, we are forced to look at the cold, hard reality of the present day, because despite the FBI's best efforts, despite the exhumation of Roger Arnold, and despite the arrest of James William Lewis, the original killer of Mary Kellerman, the Janus family, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner remains a free, unidentified phantom.
Bryan Midnight and Art Midnight want to thank you for staying with us through this grueling, meticulous timeline. If you are still listening on our master archive on the Chicago Tylenol murders, you are the reason we produce these feature-length investigations. Please take a moment to subscribe to Midnight Ledger Audio, leave a like, and tell us in the comments if you remember the panic of 1982. Your engagement keeps the ledger open. Chapter 14. The $1 Million Denials.
McNeil Laboratories sued. They argued that the language of their excess liability insurance policy should cover the unprecedented recall and its related expenses. The legal fight dragged through the courts, but the judge handed down a stunning ruling. The court determined that McNeil Laboratories was ultimately not covered because the parent company Johnson & Johnson had previously elected not to purchase specific, more expensive recall insurance. Furthermore, the court stated that the recall itself was not caused by liability for the 7 deaths. Instead, the 7 deaths merely served as a horrific notice to the company that the remaining Tylenol on the shelves was potentially lethal. The recall was a preventative measure, not a liability payout. Johnson & Johnson had to absorb the staggering financial blow on their own. But what about the victims' families? What about the Kellermans, the Januses, the Reiners, the Princes, and the McFarlands? For nearly a decade, the families pursued lawsuits against the pharmaceutical giant, arguing that the packaging of the capsules was inherently unsafe and practically invited tampering. Finally, in May of 1991, nearly 9 years after the murders, Johnson & Johnson agreed to settle all lawsuits against it regarding the original Chicago area deaths. The financial terms of the settlement were strictly confidential and remain undisclosed to this day. Robert Kniffen, a spokesman for the company, addressed the media with a solemn statement.
Though there is no way we could have anticipated a criminal tampering with our product or prevented it, we wanted to do something for the families and finally get this tragic event behind us.
The lawsuits were settled, the packaging was fixed, but the criminal investigation was growing colder by the day. Decades passed. The files in the FBI's Chicago field office gathered dust. The Phantom had won until the dawn of the 21st century, when science finally caught up with the past.
Chapter 15. The Unabomber and the 21st Century Hunt.
By 2007, the 25th anniversary of the Chicago Tylenol murders had come and gone. The case was a legendary, impenetrable monolith in the annals of American true crime. But behind closed doors, law enforcement was quietly renewing the hunt. They had a weapon in 2009 that simply did not exist in 1982. Touch DNA. Investigators knew that the killer had handled the bottles, pulled apart the gelatin capsules, and packed the cyanide. Even a microscopic shedding of skin cells, trapped under a label or inside a plastic cap, could theoretically yield a complete genetic profile. In early January 2009, Illinois authorities, alongside federal agents, made a sudden, shocking move. They raided the home of our primary suspect, James William Lewis, who was now living quietly in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They seized computers, boxes, and personal items. The following year, in January 2010, the FBI formally requested DNA samples and fingerprints from Lewis and his wife. Lewis, ever the arrogant grifter, confidently stated to the press,
"If the FBI plays it fair, I have nothing to worry about."
He was right. The DNA extracted from James Lewis did not match the microscopic profiles found on the tainted 1982 bottles. Desperate to close the circle on their second prime suspect, the FBI took an extreme measure. Roger Arnold, the paranoid dock worker who had murdered an innocent man in a fit of rage, had died in 2008. In 2010, investigators exhumed his corpse. They removed his femur bone to extract a pristine DNA sample. They ran it against the bottles. Negative. Another dead end. The two best suspects in the history of Operation Norjack. We also covered this on our previous videos. The strange disappearance of a D.B. Cooper full documentary. Watch and listen to that if you haven't yet. The Tylenol task force were officially genetically cleared of the physical handling of the poison. But in May 2011, the FBI announced they were seeking the DNA of a new, highly unconventional suspect. A man whose name was synonymous with domestic terror. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. At first glance, the connection seems absurd. Kaczynski was a male bomber who targeted universities and airlines from a remote cabin in Montana. What did he have to do with poisoned painkillers in Chicago? When the FBI profiled the Tylenol killer, they looked for motive. Extortion was one theory, but pure anti-corporate sabotage was another. Who hated modern society, industrialization, and massive corporations more than Ted Kaczynski? Investigators looked at Kaczynski's timeline. It was terrifyingly plausible. The first 4 Unabomber attacks took place in Chicago and its surrounding suburbs between 1978 and 1980. Kaczynski knew the area intimately. Even more damning, in 1982, his parents lived in a house in Lombard, Illinois, a suburb located right in the middle of the poisoning cluster. Ted Kaczynski occasionally stayed at that house. He had the geographic proximity. He had the anti-corporate motive. He was a brilliant mathematician who knew chemistry and knew how to build lethal traps. The FBI requested his DNA to compare it to the Tylenol bottles. From his maximum security prison cell, Kaczynski vehemently denied any involvement. He stated he had never possessed potassium cyanide and considered the indiscriminate poisoning of ordinary citizens completely outside his strict anti-technology manifesto. The DNA connection was never publicly proven. Kaczynski died in prison in 2023. And once again, the phantom of Chicago slipped back into the fog.
Chapter 16. The Phantom in the Aisle, the Final Verdict.
We are left with a ghost story. The Chicago Tylenol murders fundamentally changed the way we interact with the physical world. Every time you struggle to peel back a foil seal, every time you pop a blister pack, every time you check the plastic ring on a bottle of water, you're interacting with the legacy of September 28, 1982. The killer won the battle. He terrorized a nation, crippled a billion-dollar corporation, and executed 7 innocent people without ever facing a judge. He committed the perfect crime. But he lost the war. His actions forced society to build armor. He inadvertently triggered regulations and packaging innovations that have undoubtedly saved millions of lives from accidental contamination and future saboteurs. But who was he? Was he the bearded man standing behind Paula Prince in the grainy Walgreens security footage? Did he watch her buy the bottle, knowing exactly what was going to happen to her? Did he read the obituaries of the Janus family with a sick sense of pride, or did the sheer magnitude of the horror cause him to retreat, burying his remaining cyanide and taking his secret to the grave? As of today, the FBI's investigation remains officially open, but the leads have dried up. The detectives who worked the case are retired or gone. The victims are buried in the cold Illinois earth. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, Mary Reiner. 7 lives extinguished for absolutely no reason. 7 people who simply wanted to cure a headache and instead became the casualties of a madman's game. The next time you walk down the brightly lit aisle of your local pharmacy, look at the rows of perfectly sealed, tamper-evident boxes. Remember the price that was paid for that safety. And remember that somewhere in the dark history of Chicago, a monster walked those very same aisles and simply faded away.
The Midnight Ledger audio outro.
You have survived the absolute depths of the archive. This concludes our exhaustive investigation into the Chicago Tylenol murders. Midnight Ledger Audio presents these massive documentaries because we believe that history's darkest corners deserve the brightest lights. This documentary was narrated by Bryan Midnight, and the countless hours of historical research, FBI file declassification, and timeline reconstruction were conducted by Bryan Midnight. If you made it to the very end of this journey, you are the lifeblood of this channel. Please, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment below. Tell us, do you think the killer was a criminal mastermind who planned the perfect escape, or just a lucky sociopath who slipped through the cracks? What documentary should we do next? Please comment down below. We like the best ones. Keep the ledger open, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next archive.